Beautiful. And we're live. Hi, welcome everyone. This is the very first episode of this podcast. Welcome to the Artistic License. I'm your host. My name is Mari Rios Gacua. I am an artist. I'm going to give you a little intro about myself, but thank you for tuning in today. I'm sitting here on January 3rd of 2025. Happy New Year, everyone. This is such a crazy thing to be sitting here recording this. And this is like a solo episode. So this podcast, to give you a little background about me actually, before we start with the podcast. I am I am an artist. I currently live in New York City. I've been living here now going on 2.5 years. It'll be 3 years officially in June. It's been a really crazy time. In my life the past couple of years. I just recently, this past year, graduated with my MFA, my Master's of Fine Arts in Fine Arts. And I also have a BFA, which is a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Fine Arts. So you could say that I've been pursuing the arts for a very long time. It's the world of the arts. It's something that I'm incredibly passionate about and super interested in. Not only am I an artist, I've also worked as a museum professional for the past maybe 6 years at this point. And along with that, I am also a teaching artist, so teacher. So living, existing, working in all these spaces, the intersection of all these spaces. And I think there's so many things that's really interesting to think about when you're talking about the art world. And I think there's a lot of things that people that aren't in the art world don't have any idea about. This podcast, I'm probably going to post this on the 25th, as to be January 25th of 2025, really going and digging into that numerology, good energy. But this podcast and the conception of this is something that I've actually been thinking about for the past few years, as I've obviously been someone who's been involved in the arts and been in the art world, but I also have a lot of friends and a lot of acquaintances and a lot of folks that are not in the art world. So there's a lot of things and a lot of nuances that they don't know, because it's one of those things that, like, if you're not in those spaces, you're not going to understand that same level to someone that like is in those spaces. So for me, wanting to think about this podcast, it's like not only a space where I can yap, because when it comes to the art world, I'm a yapper. When it comes to the arts, I'm a yapper. Talking about artists, art history. I minored in art history in my undergrad. So really, like, this space is the one space this space and in books, I'm a yapper. So it's really great to be sitting down, taking the time to really bring this out into the world. And, I finally, there's a lot of things that has been changing with our government, our newest administration that is just about to take office. By the time this podcast goes live, they will have already taken office, and who knows what will become of the world as we know it in that week. But it's really so lovely to be sitting here and to be talking about the art world and some of the things that I want to think about. And I want to talk about just like, what is it to be an artist? I think for the longest time, I wasn't super comfortable with just the concept of like calling myself an artist. I think it's one of those things that, like, when I was little and growing up, like, being an artist is not something that you're thinking about as a real viable career. Like, when you're thinking about it, you're 15, 16, 17, and they're telling you and they're asking you, oh, what are you going to be when you grow up? What are you going to be when you go to college? And you're thinking of like, oh, what's something practical that like normal people do? What's going to make me money? What's going to, you know, make me an adult? And something like being an artist just wasn't something that I ever like actually considered. Don't get me wrong, I was always very much involved in the arts. I was always drawing. There's sketchbooks in my parents' house back in, my family lives in Florida. There's literally sketchbooks stored away from middle school of things that I've drawn and things that I've kept and have not been able to let go of. But it's something that I always did. I was in choir in high school. I also did a couple musicals as an extension of choir. So it was always something that I was involved in the arts and interested in. but it was never something that I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna grow up and I'm gonna do this. Like, in fact, when I was in high school, I had actually applied, the majority of the schools that I applied to for undergrad were schools that I had applied for forensic science, chemistry, and I didn't even end up applying to art school up until my high school teacher at the time. She was very adamant that I was an artist. She would look at the work that I would have and the things that I would do, and sitting in her class, in her like advanced art class, our version of AP art, we didn't have AP art in my high school, but our version of that. And she was like, "You are an artist." And to me, that was such a strange thing to be called as, 17, 16, 17, um, sitting there and being told that you are an artist. And I was like, no, I'm just an exhausted student. Like, I'm just trying to go to my sports, trying to get all my classes, trying to graduate so I can get out and continue on to whatever life has for me. But I was also given the opportunity to apply to college with fee waivers. So because I had fee waivers, applying to university for my undergrad actually wasn't a huge expense in the same way that it typically is, or like at least for my master's, it definitely was to apply for schools. So because of the fact that I had the fee waivers, it wasn't going to cost me extra. I only had to write additional essays and make up portfolios. I decided to apply to art school. I applied to a handful of art schools, and my thought at the time, like looking back, it's really just like such a joke to think back and talk about it. But at the time, I was like, oh, I'm gonna apply to these schools. I'm gonna apply to these like art schools, and I'm gonna get all these rejections, and then I'll show this teacher that like what like lady, what are you talking about? I'm not an artist, very clearly by these like prestigious art schools all saying no to me. And lo and behold, I ended up getting acceptances. So with that, it was then having to sit there and having so many people around me and art teachers, and then like some of the few kids that like were looking to pursue creative careers being like, oh my God, like these schools are incredible. Like you're really so talented to be getting into this. And obviously running through my head, I was like, I just don't get it. I think they made a mistake. Like I don't know how I am somebody that like is being chosen to exist in these spaces, and being considered for these spaces. But obviously, for me, financial aid was a really massive part of choosing where to go to college. I'm very blessed that my family was able to take me on a trip so that I could go through and visit all these schools and check them out and see what I was looking to potentially experience as I went off to college and what I wanted to consider. And I ended up choosing a school in DC, like genuinely the architecture and everything in there just absolutely stunning. And I really felt welcomed by the students there when I visited. And one of the things with that school that I chose, I ended up choosing to go to George Washington University. In the end, I was choosing between Rhode Island School of Design. For anyone who knows, RISD is considered to be one of like the top tier types of programs for the arts. Um, but I toured both of them back to back, and I just felt I really love the community aspect at George Washington University. At the Corcoran specifically is the name of my school within GW. And obviously, because I was already at the time somebody that didn't really consider art as like a real career, I also wanted to be practical of the fact that like, the Corcoran School of Arts and Design is a part of the George Washington University, which is a larger research institution. If I get there and I'm like, this is not for me, I can very easily switch majors without having to think about transferring schools and then potentially losing any money because I did end up going to school with a full ride. So for me, this was the safe, but also like risky decision of choosing. However, I went into the Corcoran with like my major declared as a BFA fine arts student. And for anyone who has never been to art school before, in undergrad, basically your first year is like fully decided for you. You might be able to decide some like one or two electives and at what time those are. But outside of that, it's your foundation year. So you're basically taking all the basics, you're taking drawing classes, and you're taking studio classes. All these studio classes are going to be 4 to 5 hours long, and you're sitting there and you're literally sitting there doing art for 4 to 5 hours, and that's what foundation year is. And through that year, I just like fell in love with it. I fell in love with being in that space, and like I had obviously already been someone that was drawing before and doing arts, but it was another thing to be sitting there and really considering like theory, considering concept, to be sitting in a figure drawing class and having live models sitting in front of you 4 hours, and you were sitting there and you're like, at a certain point in something like that, like they stop being models and it starts feeling like, oh, the lines of your body are like they're just lines, and I can't get this line quite right. And thinking about things like that was so interesting. And I chose to continue, and then I ended up minoring in art history because I have always loved like thinking about things in the past and challenging myself, and thinking about art history was something that was really interesting to me, particularly as I went into the second half of my sophomore junior year. I had a professor who was teaching Latin American art history, and I'm originally from Colombia. I'm from Bogota, and for me, being able to sit in a space where I was learning and hearing about artists that were not, predominantly white European men, it made like a huge difference for me. And I, in that moment, like obviously decided to minor in art history, but it's something that I really started to feel like, oh, like there are people who pursued this, and like, yeah, thinking about contemporary art is like a really crazy thing because it's like one of those things where the joke that people, if you think about Miami Basel, um, Art Basel, and you think about some of like the art pieces that have shown there, if you think about the banana with duct tape to a wall, and we can talk later on in this podcast about like the intricacies of something like that. But when you're thinking about stuff like that, it's very easy to see why a lot of folks in mainstream media like look at contemporary art and they're like, this is a joke. Like I can also buy a banana and take duct tape and put it to a wall. So when you're like at that age of like trying to figure it out, like I was still figuring out what it meant for me to be an artist. It and I graduated during the pandemic, to give you some additional context. So it was really interesting. Like I honestly, I wouldn't say that I even called myself an artist up until my senior year of undergrad, when I took a class, and it was like a professional practices type course, but I had the professor for a different class previously. And I'll never forget, she had us sit and do an exercise where she was like, we're gonna write a prompt, and you're gonna write to yourself, and you're gonna call yourself an artist. And everyone in my class struggled. All of us really go, like, what does it mean to be an artist? Like, what does it mean to call ourselves that? And there are people in like different disciplines. There were some photojournalists, there were photographers, there were sculpture performance folks, but we were all sitting there and grappling with this label and this notion of being called an artist. And that really stuck with me because it's something that, if I was graduating and I was looking at jobs and I was looking at like what does this mean? Like, am I going to continue the arts, and like what am I going to do? Especially graduating during a pandemic where you like don't know what's going on. There's a lot of really scary things happening around you, and seeing how the world is existing. So for me, like after graduation, I had to take some time to like figure out if like yeah, I really enjoyed getting my bachelor's. I really enjoyed my college experience, but like, is this did I just wait 4 years to not get a career? And that was a really scary thought for me. And also thinking about like, not only did I maybe not figure out what my career would be, but I also don't have a passion for this anymore. And like, what does this mean? And I had worked in my undergrad. I had gotten an opportunity to work in a museum previously, and that was something that I really enjoyed. Obviously, school, you get so caught up in like what you're doing. So when I graduated, I decided to move back to Florida, move in with my parents to save money, not spend on rent, and look at what it meant to be an artist and decompress in light of like a very tumultuous time to be graduating and to be existing. And it was probably the best thing I could have done for myself. Not only was I able to go back to my practice and like really think about what it meant for me to be an artist and what it meant for the kind of work that I wanted to be making and the types of conversations I wanted to be having. But then I also got the opportunity to work at the Tampa Museum of Art. And working in there, before then, I had worked at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. And both experiences were great, but when I worked at the Tampa Museum of Art, I felt like it was one of those spaces where I finally like was really constantly and often exposed to art and exposed to not just artists that had already passed away and were already deceased, but also getting access to contemporary art and seeing like what was going on and getting to meet some of these artists and also getting to see the museum world in like a very like art focused lens as opposed to obviously working for the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. You're thinking about it and experiencing a federally funded museum. It's also very different because it's focused on artifacts rather than in a way like intellectual property, and art is intellectual property. So seeing the ways that like the things are considered and the way that people view things, also experiencing like what it's like to exist in a museum space versus what a gallery space would be like. I thought that was so interesting to me, and it was through that year, through that like months going into the fall that I decided that I would then apply for my MFA. And I applied for my MFA. I got accepted to a couple different MFA programs. And it's what brought me here to New York. And the past, I did a 2-year program for my MFA. And sitting there in an MFA, it's very much like an artist residency. Like it's a very expensive artist residency. Let's put it that way. I did get financial aid to be able to attend, but New York is also a very expensive city. So being coming out here and pursuing that was definitely something that I had to like really think about, look at, and like what that would look like in terms of being realistic. But within the program, I was in undergrad, you're exposed to a lot of conceptual, you're exposed to a lot of theory. But when you're a master's, it's like, oh, like you already know all this. Like a good chunk of the people that go into master's programs tend to be folks that are coming from a bachelor's program. They've already done all the theory, they've done all the basics. They're just trying to get in and continue working and pushing and furthering their studio practice. And I definitely had classmates that did not come from like an art education and like that BFA kind of background. But getting exposed to contemporary art and getting exposed to contemporary art in New York in to the level that I was getting it, as opposed to, when you're passively getting it, particularly in a state like Florida where there's only specific spaces where you can really see it, was very eye-opening in terms of like seeing how I would fit into that space. And I say this as someone who, when I came to New York, I decided to continue working in museums. I worked at the MoMA and I worked at the Met, and it sounds very prestigious, and it is prestigious to work at these institutions, but I was at the Met, I worked at the shop, and then at MoMA I was working as a guest assistant, working basically within visitor experience, which is something that I think is really interesting and passionate about. But I basically the entire time I've been here in New York, I've been working in museums. So getting the duality of working in museums and then getting all this contemporary work, all of your professors in a master's program are living, working artists. They live, breathe the space. They know what's going on in the art world. They're recommending shows for you to go. You're going to different shows during class. You're going to museum shows, gallery shows. You're seeing the difference to all these things. And I had been in some shows previously, and I have been in exhibitions for my own personal work before, but it's a whole other playing field to be sitting there and then really having to claim that title of artist and really having to sit with it and thinking about the different ways that just the label of artist has evolved and changed for me has been a really interesting relationship. And I don't know, I definitely think it's something that I talk about oftentimes with, particularly with my classmates and friends from my master's program. Looking back, like the different ways that we claim that title and the different ways that we think about, oh yeah, I'm an artist, I'm this type of artist, I'm that type of artist. really changes based on obviously like what you're doing and what you think is important as a part of your practice, but there's a sense of relief in being able to claim the word when you really feel it, in the same way that I'm sure it would feel with anything else. This career field is definitely one where like imposter syndrome is like such a big thing, so massive. And I definitely struggle with it constantly, like dealing with imposter syndrome, but I also know that I know my work, I know my practice. And at the end of the day, that's really all that you need when it comes to making it work. It's that it's going to be you and your work day in and day out. It's going to be your longest relationship. But it's also, at least for me, it's a space where I go to process everything that I go on through in life. If I have a hard day, if, you know, what's going on in the world is really affecting me, like that's the space where I can always go and process these things. And if I choose to make work about it, I can make work about it. Being someone that does make a lot of work that is politically centered or politically charged, it is something that is very much within my wheelhouse. It's so interesting having or starting a little podcast where you're like the main person speaking, because I definitely feel like I just have gone on different little tangents, but I definitely think thinking about the word artist is a very or thinking about the different labels that we give to ourselves, especially as we get older and we become adults and start that career field and start to figure out, oh, what is it that I'm doing with my life? Where is it that I'm going? What is it that I'm changing? So I definitely think that whole train of thought is incredibly interesting. It's also something that at any given point in time, you can be an artist without being a practicing artist. You can be an artist without having gallery shows. You can be an artist without having museum shows. You can be an artist who literally only makes work for their apartment and for gifts. Like that title does not need to be earned to be able to call yourself an artist. And I think that's something really important. And I think that's a lot of artists. It's something that a lot of artists really struggle with. I know I struggled with it for a long time. Every now and then I still struggle with it. And I know some of my artist friends definitely still struggle with that and think about it depending on what they're going through, what they're experiencing. Like, so when I'm saying all this to really give you kind of like a glimpse of what this podcast is going to be. Like today, it's very much giving you a little introduction and background as to who I am and what has kind of led me to this moment and talking about what that means. But moving on to the future and moving on to like next episodes and in general, how I think about this podcast and how I think about this space is a space to talk about just everything that's going on in the art world, talk about shows that are really exciting, that are things that I'm thinking about. I think it's also important to talk about art history and talk about different artists, movements, things that have been going on. And this is going to be very much like an inside look as to what it is to be a creative in the arts. And when I say the arts, I don't just mean visual arts. I definitely want to talk about spaces like music, talk about spaces like theater, dance. I have friends in these different fields, and I definitely want to bring their perspectives onto here. But I guess all I can say is thank you for listening so far. Definitely a bit of a rambling one. Hope it wasn't too bad. I'm really excited to see where and what this space is going to look like. It's definitely going to be ever changing, and a lot of it is going to be like what I'm interested in at the moment and what I'm seeing and what I'm excited about. But I definitely am excited to keep this going and to have this space to be able to really like look at the arts and think about like this world and these spaces. And also, very importantly, I'm an artist that is based in New York. I'm based in the United States, so anything that is going on politically is gonna, in some way, shape, or form, will likely come up, particularly if certain legislation gets passed. So there'll definitely be moments where we'll be talking about all that as it comes with in general existing. But yeah, you can follow on all the socials. Socials is just going to be Artistic License Pod. You can follow me at mcrios.studio on my socials. That's how you can follow my practice if you want to check out the work that I do. And I can do an episode where I talk about like what my actual practice consists of, but for now, that's just kind of like a little background and then my thoughts on it. Something I'm really excited about right now, though, before we end the episode to end on a very exciting note. For anyone who's in New York or will be in New York for the next few weeks, one of my friends and classmates actually has a public art sculpture that is in Washington Square Park. It's going to be up in Washington Square Park. It's from January 9th through March 30th of this year, 2025. It's the opening event for it is going to be on January 26th at 3 p.m. And there's going to be a performance by my good friend Gino Romero. They will be doing a performance in conjunction with the piece. And the piece is by Ryan Vanderhout. I really hope I didn't butcher their name. I'm so sorry, Ryan, if I did. I love you. I'll be there. Don't you worry. But let me read you a little bit about the sculpture but this is a really big deal to be having a public art sculpture in Washington Square Park. I'm so excited, so happy that they're getting this opportunity to show their work, to give you information about the sculpture. It's titled To Reflect Everything, a monumental sculpture that blends the gleaming facets of a disco ball with the sleek form of a space satellite. Set to debut on January 9th, 2025, and remain on view through March 30th, 2025, this 7-foot mirrored sphere invites viewers into a thought-provoking meditation on the themes of reflection, connection, and the potential for change. The sculpture's striking surface, made up of hundreds of polished steel panels, reflects and refracts the surrounding environment in mesmerizing ways, offering an immersive experience for park visitors. As they gaze into the sculpture, they see themselves, the park, the city around them, both fractured and reimagined, splintered into unexpected shapes and patterns that challenge the way we see the world. Deliberate gaps between the panels introduce moments of darkness within that reflection, suggesting the hidden or lost elements of our shared reality. More than just a visual spectacle, To Reflect Everything is a dialogue between the present moment and what lies ahead, perpetually suspended between departure and arrival. The sculpture evokes a tension between the familiar and the unknown, offering viewers a chance to contemplate not only what is visible, but also what might be waiting to emerge. I'm so excited. I'm also doing a video portion for this podcast. So for the video, I'll include a little photo of it. But yeah, thank you for tuning in, for listening to my little rambles for today. Please comment. I think you can comment down below. You can comment on my socials. Any things that you want me to talk about, you want to hear about, for sure, let me know. I'm excited to be starting this, and happy 2025. We'll see you next week.